it is the end of an era. The Visiting Forces Agreement between the Philippines and the United States terminated.
Executive Secretary sent the message to Secretary Locsin, and the latter signed the notice of termination and sent to the U.S. government today.
A decision which the Foreign Affairs Secretary says is a good move, but earlier admitted would have consequences.
The continuance of the agreement is deemed to be more beneficial to the Philippines compared to any benefits were it to be terminated.
The decision was prompted by the cancellation of the U.S. visa of former Philippine National Police Chief and now Senator Bato de la Rosa.
Pag hindi ninyo ginawa ang correction dyan, I will terminate the bases Visiting Forces Agreement.
I really don't mind if they would like to do that. That's fine. Thank you very much. You saved a lot of time.
Now, the clock is ticking to the end of a 180-day period when the 2 decades-old agreement would be effectively over. Thank you for joining us. I'm Pinky Webb. This is a special presentation of The Source on the Visiting Forces Agreement. As President Rodrigo Duterte moves towards an independent foreign policy, Foreign Affairs Secretary Teddy Boy Locsin Jr. says the termination of the Visiting Forces Agreement will now give the Philippines a chance to stand on its own. On Tuesday, the Philippines officially sent the notice of termination to their U.S. counterparts, marking the end of an era on US-Philippine relations. What is the Visiting Forces Agreement and how does it affect Filipinos? Tricia Terada spoke to an expert for more details.
The Visiting Forces Agreement outlines the obligations of Philippines and U.S. under the Mutual Defense Treaty or MDT. It's basically a commitment of both countries to respond to any armed attack. Through the VFA, Filipino soldiers can train with the U.S. military at minimal or less expenses. Take, for example, the Balikatan exercises. According to defense expert Jose Antonio Custodio, the VFA somehow makes up for what the Philippine military lacks, from capacity building to equipment. But the VFA is not just about that. Many times, American soldiers have helped the Philippine troops in disaster response. During Typhoon Yolanda, for example, the VFA cut down the tedious paperwork for the entry and exit of American forces that will help in the operations. Aid came in easily from the U.S. to affected areas.
Shortages of aircraft, vehicles, because it was overused in disaster response. So that is something that has to be considered, of course, which is not being bothered about.
In 1995, Custodio recalls there was no VFA. He says it was the lowest point of our military alliance. It was around the same period when China moved into mischief reef. With the increasing aggressiveness of the Chinese in the West Philippine Sea, plus problems with armed forces modernization at that time, the U.S. and the Philippines started talking again to come up with a VFA. Custodio says it's something that the president surely knows, and the threat against the U.S. for canceling his loyal ally Bato's visa could just be for show. And even if the president backs off from terminating the VFA, Custodio says damage has been done.
These are actions that practically weaken the alliance, and these are intentional. Bato is just an excuse.
Worst possible scenario of it all, according to Custodio, the government may enter into a VFA with China.
Maybe the Duterte administration wants to legalize China's occupation of our West Philippine Sea by giving them a status of forces agreement. So then China can say, hey, we're here by your agreement. I don't know, but it looks so ludicrous.
For many years, militant groups have been calling for an end to VFA, so they welcome the scrapping of the agreement with the U.S., but they say it must be for the right reasons.
We challenge the president to really pursue it because it is an assertion of our national sovereignty in the real sense of the word, and not just because a friend of him is disadvantaged.
And at the same time, of course, they don't want Chinese troops in once American soldiers are out. Although it's imperfect, the VFA with the U.S., Custodio says, has generated some good things for the country, which should not be overlooked.
To complain about the imperfections of the Visiting Forces Agreement and to scrap it, and at the same time to turn a blind eye to China's theft of our territory willingly, which is allowed by the Duterte administration, is practically something that is outrageous.
Senator Panfilo Locsin has earlier expressed fear of retaliation from the U.S. in case the VFA is scrapped. Trisha Terada, CNN, Philippines.
Let's go straight to the sources of the story. We have former Senators Rodolfo Biazon and Orly Mercado. Senators, so good to see you again, both.
Thank you.
Welcome
You
to
too.
the show. Very important, of course, especially for you, Senator, because you're the author of the Visiting Forces Agreement back in 1998, which was ratified in 1999. Just a quick overview, Senator Pong, why the need? Why did you author the VFA?
Well, I was chairman of the Defense Committee at the time, no? And my co-chair was either Senator Ople or Senator Miriam Santiago. And there were, in those hearings, we had to invite Ambassador Hubbard. And when I asked him a question, because just in the middle of our hearings, the commander of the Pacific Command, I think it was Admiral Shepard, issued a statement in Singapore. This is in the middle of the hearing. And he said, the Sprat list, which we have claimed, is not covered by the Mutual Defense Treaty. So in that hearing, I asked Ambassador Hubbard, is this the policy of the United States now, that the Mutual Defense Treaty does not cover this practice? I said, if this is so, I said, I'm voting against the Visiting Forces Agreement. So Ambassador Hubbard said, I cannot answer that question. Only somebody from the State Department can answer that. So we need, I said, that representative. In 3 days, the representative came and presented to us a note verbal which stated that Sprati is covered the Mutual Defense Treaty.
Kasama siya sa MDT. The MDT, of course, back in 1951.
51, well, the Mutual, yes.
Yes.
This is several years after the adoption of the Military Assistance Pact and the Military Bases Agreement.
Right. Okay. Senator Orly Mercado, though, very interesting just to look back. 1987 to 1992, you were senator. And it was in 1991 that the vote on the extension would either have been approved or otherwise. I just want to look back to 1991. Senator Orly, you voted against the extension?
Yeah, I was one of the 12 that rejected the military basis agreement, which required two-thirds vote for it to be ratified. And later on, when I was Secretary of Defense
in 1998,
after I finished my 2 terms in the Senate, I had the responsibility of also going to the Senate and arguing about the importance of passing the Visiting Forces Agreement. My president, President Erap Estrada, was also with me. We voted against the basis
extension.
And political pundits were saying, how come you guys, you were the ones who voted against the basis agreement, and now you're voting in favor of the Visiting Forces
Help
Agreement?
us understand that.
Well, it was a simple, from my point of view, if you do a cost-benefit analysis of what we need in terms of security, it was a necessary matter. Remember that even when we rejected the basis agreement, we did not reject the Mutual Defense Treaty. The Mutual Defense Treaty of 1951 still prevailed. For all its difficulties and its the nuances there in terms of ironclad guarantees, if there's an attack on the country for its vessels, airplanes, or for armed forces, the response should be automatic on the part. That has been an old issue. But when it came to, after the rejection in 1991, nawala na yung support ng USA. Whether it's, the exercises were lost, were stopped, And not only that, our support in terms of the material, the war material we need for our spare parts, for the ships to continue to
All gone.
sail and our airplanes continue to fly, was gone. We were all on our own. So that was one of the needs. The other need there was that through the years, when the bases were here, the attitude, the relationship with the Americans was this. The Americans would tell us, you take care of your internal problems. We will protect you with the umbrella, the protective security umbrella for external defense. But things were changing already. This is 1991. Later on, as you have noticed, in 1989, there was a sea change, collapse of the Soviet Union. The world was changing, and we are at the cusp of a new era, fourth industrial revolution, and a lot of things were happening, technology. So in that particular transition, we felt that the exercises would bring back a lot of benefits. Because like, the military, and Pong knows more than I do on this matter, you need an armed force that is not only well-armed, but an armed force that exercises, that plans wars, and does exercises, whether in the field or in tabletop exercises. You have to flex your muscles to be able to respond to emergencies.
So now that the president terminated the visiting forces agreement, which will be effective 180 days, possibly since the
178 from now.
because it was Tuesday
Yes.
when it was formally told to the United States. What would be the net effect of that? Immediate net effect of the termination after now? First is what I want to ask now, and possibly after 180 days.
This termination or serving of a notice of termination by the president, we still have 178 days for the conduct of a review.
Right.
And I agree with the proposition that we have to review. But here, it's not just the visiting forces agreement that must be reviewed. We must extend the review to the Mutual Defense Treaty and EDCA. So there's a question. The question is, do we need it? Do we need them? Considering the existing conditions and situations
We are faced right now.
in the South, especially the South China Sea.
Yes.
Okay. Now, the next question that must be resolved is, what is the legal and constitutional process to have this effected? No. I remember that when I was asked a question during the hearings in 1999, the question was, do we need to ratify the visiting
DFA.
forces agreement
Right.
when this is not ratified by the U.S. Senate?
Correct.
So my answer was this: which constitution do we follow? Do we follow
The Philippines.
the U.S. constitutions that allows this non-ratification by the U.S. Senate, or do we follow our own constitution? In one of those questions, I had to put an answer kung kailangan ba natin i-ratify. Sabi ko, the Constitutional Commission's records of proceedings states that an international agreement or even a treaty requires a two-thirds vote from the Senate to ratify it. If the agreement contains three characteristics.
I see. Okay.
One, is it political in nature? Now, the mention of Senator De La Rosa's name contributes for us to need to examine, was the decision political in nature? Number two, it must be permanent in nature. Okay? And the third is, if we implement the agreement, will it require certain changes in existing national policies? So yung tatlo na yun, any one of that is present, we need to ratify by the Senate any
I
international
see.
agreement.
So any of these three,
Yes.
if any one is present, this needs to be
Yes.
ratified. So there was, I read something, Senator Pong, that you were saying that the Senate was reviewing this, and then the President canceled it. And you said that the Senate should continue reviewing the VFA.
Exactly.
It doesn't become useless? You don't think it becomes useless
Because
right now?
the thing is this. No, it's not. We still have 178 days period to effect a review of the matter. Now, that's why when Senate President Tito Soto said, this needs to be
This needs to be what? Which one are you referring to?
reviewed.
Okay.
All right. Now, the basis for that, I would refer to the incident of former President Aquino
Okay.
in 1991. When President Aquino was pushing for the extension or non-termination of the military basis agreement of 1947.
Right.
You know, the simple majority vote defeated the efforts of former President Aquino to extend.
Further.
To extend.
All right. So there's still so much to talk about this because, at least there was some sort of definition of terms with the basis agreement, the Mutual Defense Treaty, the VFA, and then the EDCA. We'll be taking a very short break. Coming up, can the Philippines survive without the Visiting Forces Agreement with the United States? And does the termination of the VFA need the Senate's approval? This is a special presentation of The Source on CNN Philippines. Please stay tuned. You're watching The Source on CNN Philippines. Our guests today, former Senators Rodolfo Biazon and Orly Mercado. There was a hanging question there, and it's good to really find out. Can the Philippines survive without the VFA? And or how much of a loss is it? Senator Orly.
Well, you'll excuse professors like me. We like putting frameworks before we answer a question. But I'll be very quick because I'm aware of our shortness of time. I just would like to quote a British statesman who said, "Nations have no permanent enemies, no permanent friends, only permanent interests."
Agree.
It is very important for us to be able to focus on this statement because we as a nation must identify our core interests. The Chinese Lucian Pai says that China is a civilization pretending to be a nation. Their history is millennia, not hundreds of years. And you can see, even if you study modern history, including Mao, etc., the thread of their core interest is kind of obvious. They've always been saying, Tibet is ours, Taiwan is ours, South China is ours. For us, my question is, have we defined our our core interests? Why is that question vital? Because for me, the rejection or the setting aside of the Visiting Forces Agreement is only part of a problem that comes out of. Are we really shifting alliances? You have to answer that particular question.
Yes.
Because you also have, we have rejected the basis agreement and then we agreed to the VFA largely because of the fact that it was not a rejection of the alliance. We only have one treaty alliance. There is no other country with which we have a security alliance except the United States. The question is it proper now for us to reject that particular alliance? Is it in our interest to reject it? If we conclude as a nation, and I would like to believe this is not only a military issue, this is a defense issue. And if it is a defense policy, you must cast a wide net to be able to come up with a decision because it will affect not only the military, but if speaking for the military, in behalf of the military, where I've seen the effects
Right.
of having the visiting forces agreement. To me, it is a necessity for the armed forces of the Philippines to have the visiting forces agreement.
Senator Pong, is it a necessity for the armed forces to have the visiting forces agreement? Do you agree?
Considering the present, you know, I attended the hearings in The Hague when the Permanent Court of Arbitration rendered a decision that distinguished ours. And I was also the author of the Philippine Baseline Law related to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. This, I think, is the focus, should be the focus of a review on whether we are I agree with
Shifting
Senator Orly.
alliances?
Are we shifting alliances from this direction to this direction?
But what do you think? Are we? Are we shifting alliances?
Let's study. Kaya nga hindi natin pwedeng sagutin ng categorical ngayon yan eh. Kailangan pag-aralan natin mabuti. For example, yung ruling ng Permanent Court of Arbitration, sabi sa atin yan. And being the author of the baseline law of the Philippines, mayroong mga categories dyan eh. Sovereign territory boundary, and then contiguous territory boundary, which is 12 miles, another 12 miles, and then 200 nautical miles, and that can be extended if we study the continental shelf issue.
Well, that becomes a little technical, no, Senator?
Ngayon, China has built and militarized the South China Sea. Naglagay na sila ng missile base, air base, etc., etc. The question is, we have to review all of these present factors to determine the answer to the question, do we need it? I mean, the VFA.
Yeah.
Because if we terminate the VFA is the meat of the Mutual Defense Treaty. And the EDCA and the Military Assistance Pact of 1947.
So you can't answer for now if the VFA is a necessity for the armed forces?
Yes.
You cannot. You cannot answer that, or do you agree with Senator
Well,
Orly?
as a former soldier and familiar with the situation, I would say we need it.
We need it.
Yes.
So you're both in agreement that we both need it. Does it make us vulnerable now as a country that the president is canceled the visiting forces agreement? And you're talking about aggression, the South China Sea, China. Senator
I would like
Orly.
to believe that today, the next wars, there's a saying in the military circles, do not prepare to fight the last war. If our thinking is that we prepare, and your mindset is still Korean War, Vietnam War, Second World War, you're in big trouble. The point there is that today, wars can be fought and are likely to be fought without firing a bullet.
Yeah.
Just the control over your power, your telecommunication, or even control over your election can assert power.
It's a different kind of war now,
yes, more than just sending troops. So I would like to believe that it is not easy to say that while we say we need it, that you are not in transition. Now, the modernization of the armed forces of the Philippines requires many things. Part of that is buying war material, your equipment to be able to do war fighting. But more important than that is the modernization of the entire armed forces, the reorganization that is required, upgrading of the skills, developing the manpower to be able, and the technology to be able to utilize the same weapons that are going to be used on you so that you can defend the sovereignty, the people, and the territorial integrity.
And you are one in saying that with the VFA, definitely it upgrades the skills of our soldiers. Very quick question, gentlemen. What is the Senate's role in the President's decision to cancel the VFA? The question is, does it need the concurrence of the Senate? Senator Pong?
You are asking a constitutional question. And based on past experiences and based on the readings of the proceedings, record of proceedings of the Constitutional Commission that ratified the 1987 the present Constitution,
Right.
ano? When kailangan ang power, okay, to approve a treaty or international agreement that possess any one of the three
Political in nature, political, permanent in nature,
permanency,
and will it change
in
policies?
political policy, in national policies, ano? Based on that principle, if the shared power between the Senate, hindi Congress, the Senate, and the Chief Executive, the President, to approve a treaty or international agreement, then it must play a role in the termination of such.
Do you agree, Senator Orly?
Well, I'm not a constitutional expert, but my reading is that the president is the architect of foreign policy. Our role in the Senate was just to ratify treaties. In fact, when it comes to us, it is already negotiated. And if we reject it, it has to be sent back to the executive, and they will either accept it or renegotiate it. So that's the difference. Our participation as senators was is limited only to the rejection or acceptance or ratification of agreements or treaties.
Okay.
Kaya nga, tama yung direksyon ni Senate President Soto. Kung ito yung hindi lulusot sa Senado,
Right.
and eventually we have to go to the Supreme Court to resolve the issue of the constitutionality
Right.
of determination.
Once and for all, para malaman na rin natin, kailangan ba talaga ng Senado to cancel a particular treaty? We'll be taking another short break. But for now, we'd like to thank both gentlemen. But you will be back towards the end to conclude this special coverage of ours later on in the show. We'll be right back. You're watching The Source on CNN Philippines. An expert agrees with the Justice Chief that the country can go on without the U.S. But he also warns how ending the VFA could impact national security. Our senior correspondent, David Santos, filed this report.
When Manila decided to bring back U.S. troops in 1999, it was seen as Washington playing a key role to restrain China's growing aggression in this part of the region.
That was the assumption that we can deter China. But as indicated by the construction of artificial islands in the Spratlys and occupation of the Scarborough Shoal, the BFA was not a deterrent.
This seeming rude awakening, security analyst Rommel Banlaoi says, brings back memories of 1992 when Manila evicted U.S. forces after deciding to shut down their bases in Subic and Clark.
It's the second time that their former colony has stood up against the U.S.
Once the VFA termination is finalized, U.S. troops coming to the Philippines will be subjected to regular Philippine laws, including immigration. That means U.S. servicemen deployed here will have to secure visas and permits, as well as pay duties and taxes. Without the VFA, they could be considered illegal aliens.
Kaya connected yan kay Senator Bato. So you don't want to give him visa, then you apply for visa if you want to conduct training here in the Philippines without the BFA.
But there will be price to pay, Banlaoi warns.
Ang US kasi, based on our experience, matampuhin yan. When we rejected the Basis Treaty in 1992, US withdrew everything, they denied us access to military education and training, they denied access to excess defense articles, and failed to provide us military assistance program, and US can also do it again.
It remains unclear how this would impact the armed forces. Observers insist it could lead to some level of unrest.
Of course, there are a number of opportunistic military officers who would want to ingratiate themselves with Duterte, but they are not the majority in this case.
Defense insiders, however, say so much can still happen within the 180-day period before the VFA formally ends. Aside from bilateral dialogues, including one scheduled next month, there could also be back-channel talks in a bid to restore the deal. David Santos, CNN Philippines.
And joining us now in the studio, our senior correspondent, David Santos, and regional security analyst, Rommel. Banlaoi. Gentlemen, welcome also to the show. I'm going to start with David. David has been covering the Balikatan exercises, first-hand experience. What's it like? And what's the reaction of the soldiers, both Filipino and American?
Pinky, before coming here to Manila, I used to cover the defense beat in the south, in Mindanao. I was based in Zamboanga City, and the first Balikatan experience I had was in post 9/11, when the US had to bring their troops here to fight local terrorists kasi nga as an aftermath of the 9/11 attack. Yun din sa tawag nilang second global parang war on terror. So they brought it here. They brought many troops in Zamboanga City and in Basilan and even Sulu. That was the height nung campaign against the Abu Sayyaf and other terrorist groups. So basically, yung concept nun was to train our Filipino troops on how to combat terrorism kasi it was seen then my role yung mga local terrorists which led to the attack in the US. So they were very aggressive, and that was parang post after the 1999 BFA ratification. It was in early 2000. So we can see they're not parang lumakas uli yung relationship between our armed forces and their armed forces after the closure of the US bases in 1992.
So you see an upgrade in the capability of our soldiers and skills as well. And well, coming parang after an exercise such as a Balikatan exercise, which actually means shoulder to shoulder, yung kanilang pakiramdam, kasi nakakausap mo sila, David, what do they say to you?
Firstly, syempre masaya sila, because it's an exchange, exchange of knowledge, of skills. Minsan nagyayabangan pa sila. Parang si Filipino, ito yung tinuturo ko sa Amerikano ganito rin. Yung mga Amerikano may natututunan sila sa ating mga Pilipino. Basic combat skills. Yung mga warfighting in jungle, na which ang mga Amerikano kilala sa urban setting. So, and then it's open na yung mga sa US military, marami rin mga PhilAms dyan. So marami mga napapadala dito for Balikatan are Filipino-Americans. So nandun yung relationship. So they're seen as brothers, friends, partners, allies, as yung pinapausong hashtag ng US Embassy, ng US government. But also, Pinky, we must also remember na nung nandun sila sa Zamboanga, Basilan, marami ring mga reklamo against them. Based on citing the BFA provisions. There have been cases na involved sila sa mga vehicular accidents. Remember when they came here, they bring in their vehicles, wala mga plate numbers, so they're not required to get driver's licenses. So marami mga instances na figure sila sa mga vehicular accidents. May mga instances, there was one time na may nabaril silang bata because napagkamalan nilang kalabaw sa isang target shooting range. Meron din mga instances na involved sila sa mga supposed abuses of women. So, alam mo yun, parang maganda, but at the same time, meron din siyang mga negative na instances.
Right. It's not all pretty. Okay. Professor, the immediate impact on soldiers, because David was talking about that. Ano nga ba yung impact nito sa mga Pilipinong sundalo?
Well, the impact would be difficulties for the United States to resume capacity building for our armed forces because the BFA facilitated all these military activities, joint military training, and even conduct of humanitarian missions. So without the BFA, then if the United States still decides to continue the capacity building and all these humanitarian missions, then they have to go through our normal domestic processes that we require other countries.
As you were saying, yung mga immigration issues,
Yes,
kumuha ng visa, hindi katulad ngayon, madali, labas-masok sila.
Correct.
Pero yung mga mentally, anong effect nun sa mga sundalong Pilipino pag mawala ang mga Amerikanong sundalo?
Well, there will be separation anxieties because we have been with the United States for a long time. But I think it's time to overcome that separation anxieties and stand on our feet and men for our own defense and mind our own security business.
There are two things I wanted to bring up. Former Supreme Court Senior Associate Justice in his article, Antonio Carpio, said that this sends a message to China, the cancellation of of the VFA, that the Philippines has no powerful ally now in defending the West Philippine Sea. Do you agree or
I
not?
think otherwise, it's a strong message to China that we don't want the South China Sea disputes to be a military problem, and we are willing to address the issue diplomatically and politically. So if China has military plans in the South China Sea, so we have to tell China that we don't envision a military problem in the South China Sea. We are confident about our ongoing negotiations and diplomatic approaches to solve our differences in the South China Sea. So it's a message to China that militarily, we cannot deal with you, but we are open to solve this problem politically and diplomatically. And if China still pursues military actions despite our gesture, then it will be setback against China's reputation in the region. And I don't think China will risk that kind of reputation. Because right now, Pinky, the architecture in the South China Sea has changed because when President Duterte decides to befriend China, it calmed the security situation in the South China Sea, and now there are a lot of political and diplomatic approaches to manage the South China Sea disputes. The bilateral consultative mechanism after the 5th meetings, we're not talking about conflict, we're talking about joint environmental protection, joint development, joint rescue operation, and even joint law enforcement operations.
Malaki naman daw ang naiambag ng Amerika. For example, David, Yolanda, nandun ka din nun.
Yolanda, I recall I was in Giwan. The first,
In Eastern Samar. First landfall,
military aircraft that landed in Giwan, hindi pa yung Tacloban, were U.S. aircraft.
And that was a former U.S. They built that.
Airstrip,
Yung sa Giwan,
Giwan. And then even before Yolanda, remember, bago niyan, months before, may Zamboanga siege, and there's also the earthquake in Cebu, Bohol. Lahat dyan, may mga roles din sila because in the Zamboanga siege, they provided intelligence, they provided training for the troops. And way back, in Ginsaugón, Leyte, as early as 2006, marami na rin pinadalang mga U.S. Marines to help nga retrieve yung libo-libong mga namatay doon. Just going to that point, going back to that point, Pinky, on China, medyo ina-dilemma rin ngayon ang AFP. Kasi sinasabi nila it's the president's decision, sinasabi natin that it's the president's decision to pursue warmer ties with China. So sinusunod nila yung chain of command, which is the decision of the commander-in-chief. But also, it's also in their oath of office and in the Constitution that the Armed Forces of the Philippines, ang kanilang primary mandate is to secure the sovereignty of the state and integrity of the national territory. At the back of our heads, inaagawan tayo ng China ng properties ng ating mga lupa. So how do we reconcile that now? Following the chain of command, at the same time, meron tayong issue on protecting our sovereignty.
So we'd like to thank you both. Maraming salamat kay Regional Security Analyst Rommel Banlaoi at kay David Santos. We'll be taking another short break. Coming up, what will happen to other military agreements with the United States? And is the Philippines considering other military alliances with other countries? Presidential spokesperson Salvador Panelo will be joining us after the break. You're watching The Source on CNN Philippines. Joining us now here in the studio, Presidential Spokesperson and Chief Presidential Legal Counsel Salvador Panelo. Secretary, good to see you. I have so many questions. Happy Valentine's to you. You're wearing black and so am I.
You.
Yes. Sir, U.S. President Donald Trump shrugs off this cancellation of the Visiting Forces Agreement and says that this is going to save them a lot of money. To that, you answered?
He's welcome.
Are you serious?
Was he serious?
I don't know.
So I was
I have
responding
no way
in the
to
same-
ask him, but I
in
have
the
a way
same
to ask
tone.
you.
Yeah.
Ano, sir? Were you serious or you're just joking na he's welcome? Ano ho ba? How I guess there's let me just bring this in first, sir. I wanted to ask you this. There's an Admiral Philip Davidson, Washington's top military officer for Asia Pacific. He says that this would actually hurt the counterterrorism in the South. Do you agree, sir?
Ganito yan, ha? Sabi ni Presidente, simple lang sabi ni Presidente, it is about time we stand on our own 2 feet. We cannot be relying on other countries to defend our nation from the enemies of the state. I'll quote him, kung hindi ngayon, kailan pa? This is the same slogan that we used to say in UP at the time. Kung hindi ngayon, kailan pa?
Kailan pa?
Not now, when? Palagi na lang tayo umaasa. You know, if you do that, yung depensa natin, lalong humihina. Kasi nakaasa tayo eh. Paano kung bigla tayong iniwan? So tama si Presidente. We have to strengthen our own resources. We have to be ourselves.
So if that is the case, Secretary, are we averse? Hindi ho ba tayo papayag sa kahit na anong agreement with any other country? Because we need to stand on our own 2 feet.
Ganun ang mangyayari doon.
So hindi tayo papayag sa kahit na agreement with any other country?
Yun ang sabi niya eh.
And that is the right path
Isa na
forward.
nating palakasin ang ating depensa. And that will mean, of course, pera, budget. Ganun ang gagawin talaga natin.
Yeah, yun nga yung gusto kong tanong. Sa susunod na, paano ang pera kasi to upgrade the
Maglalagay
skills
tayo ng mas
and
malaking
the equipment?
Oo, kasi lahat naman yan pwedeng matutuhan eh. Pwedeng mabili. Kailangan nag-iisa na, sabi nga ni Presidente, well, we are friends to all, enemies to none. But, if any country threatens our territorial integrity and sovereignty, we will rise to the challenge as a nation and fight like the way the forefathers of ours did during their time.
Using what equipment, sir, and what?
Kung nung panahon naman, ano ba ginamit natin? Bolo lang. Tapos nabago, ganun din ang gagawin. Kaya nga, papalakasin natin ang puwersa natin. Di mag-uupis tayong bumili ng mga high-tech weapons.
Is there anything in the pipeline, sir, na planong bilhin in the works?
Yun na nga, nag-uumpisa na tayo eh. Kasi the moment you distance or disattach yourself, di siyempre, bago ka ng team.
Secretary, is the President dead set on this? Ibig sabihin lang po, sabi nga ni Senator Pong, meron pang 178 days.
Wala na yan. Kalimutan nyo na yan. His position will be unchanged until the last day of his term.
Let me quote you, unchanged, sir.
Unchanged.
Till the end of his term.
Till the end of time.
So hindi na ho niya papalitan yun.
Kailangan talagang
What if
sariling kayod na tayo.
What about diplomatic moves, sir, to possibly make the VFA more palatable sa atin, sa Pilipinas? Mas acceptable?
Ang problema nga doon, pag ganyan ang attitude natin, palagi tayong relying on another country. Tama na yan. Baguhin na natin ang attitude natin dyan.
My question, sir, is
kaya natin yan.
If they come up with something attractive regarding the VFA, would the President have give it a second chance?
Basta sinabi ni Presidente, baguhin na natin yan.
So, hindi po. Huwag na tayong umasa na posible pang magpalit ang kanyang mind, sir.
Yun na nga ang kanyang sinasabi. Let's begin the new charting of our foreign policy.
Secretary, help us understand yung tulong po that we talked about with David a while ago. The Americans have helped us in many ways. And
tinulong nila ngayon sa dito sa virus. Parang zero May nagpadala sa akin daming mga iba't ibang bansa ang nagpadala ng kung ano-ano. Pagdating sa US daw, zero. Ewan ko totoo.
So wala ho ba tayong, is there no loss, are you saying, with the scrapping of the visiting forces agreement?
Meron, maaari bang wala? Siyempre meron, dahil umasa tayo from the very beginning. Parang hindi ba yung military base agreement? Ang dami sinasabi, mga gloom scenario. May nangyari ba? Wala naman
What can you...
Yan talaga yan.
Pero anong nakikita niyong loss with the visiting
mag-asawa na naghiwalay.
cancellation?
Hindi naman namamatay ang...
We will survive eventually.
Palagi nagsusurvive at lalo pang gumaganda nga ang buhay natin.
But hypothetically lang, sir, sabihin natin na meron ho bang chance in the event, let's say the President changes his mind, pwede ho bang bawiin yung notice of termination before the 180-day deadline?
All of us give a certain position, whatever political, social. But when circumstances change, di ba? Nababago rin yung ating posisyon So, tingnan natin.
All right, we'll be taking another short break. This is The Source on CNN Philippines. Please stay tuned. You're watching The Source on CNN Philippines. Our guest today, former Senators Rodolfo Biazon, Orly Mercado, and Presidential Spokesperson and Chief Presidential Legal Counsel Salvador Panelo. Sir, question. Yung pong bang pag-cancel ng VFA, maapektuhan ba, for example, yung aids and grants that we receive from them? Would there be some sort of effect?
Siyempre, palagi may epekto yan. Kung dating binibigyan tayo, baka hindi na sila magbigay. Pero sabi nga ni Presidente, okay lang yan. Basta tumayo tayo ng sarili natin.
Okay.
Huwag tayo umasa kahit kanino.
Paano anong mangyayari sa EDCA or sa Mutual Defense Treaty?
Gano'n na siguro. Maapektuhan. Tatamaan din yon.
Which means what?
Which means baka mawala na rin yon.
Baka.
Kung yan ang posisyon ni Presidente na hindi niya na kailangan ng alliances sa iba at tumayo na tayo ng sarili natin, talagang mawawala lahat yan.
One question posed by Senator Orly and Senator Pong was, are we shifting alliances?
Hindi shifting alliance, tinatanggal natin yung alliances natin. On our own na nga sarili na nga
And no China? No Russia?
Wala lahat. Tinanong ko si Presidente.
The presidential spokesperson saying posibleng sumunod ang EDCA at Mutual Defense Treaty. Very quickly, Senator Orly, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, very quickly, I say we have to define first, as I mentioned earlier, our core interests. And then also identify what the core interests of the United States are in our region as well as China's. Where our core interests align with them, we're fine. Where our core interests are not aligned and they're clashing, then we have to take into consideration the possibility that this unaligned interest can result to conflict. So how do you deal with that conflict is another question to be answered.
Pagka mawala ho ba, for example, ang EDCA or an MDT, Senator Pong, ano pong epekto nun sa atin? Sa Pilipinas?
Without the Visiting Forces Agreement, the MDT, Mutual Defense Treaty, and EDCA is meaningless. Because the meat of these two agreements is
the EDCA
Visiting Forces Agreement.
Yeah.
Now, if are we going to do the same with Australia? Remember, we have a Visiting Forces Agreement with Australia. I was part of the...
Okay.
So, yan ang katanungan.
Would you be able to say, Senator, answer me, if I ask you, did the President make the wrong move by canceling the Visiting Forces Agreement?
That is a very difficult question because the factors to be studied has a long list. So I cannot answer the question, do we need it now? Well, we had been there. Now, if we do not need it anymore, then the next question is, what is the process in the termination?
Yeah.
That is why I listened to Senate President Soto when he said, kailangan dumaan ito sa Senado at kung hindi, ito'y pupunta sa Korte Suprema.
Okay.
And my assumption is that you go to the Supreme Court on issues of questions of the constitutionality.
Yes. Okay. Senator Orly Mercado, last words, sir. Looking forward. What are you looking forward to with the cancellation of the VFA?
Well, the way I look at it, history will judge us. We cannot make a judgment now because we don't know the consequences yet. But this is still in a flux, and who knows? There might be some benefit out of this. This is not saber rattling. There was an actual cancellation of the visiting force.
Remember, the termination will become effective only after 178 days.
178 na lang daw, sabi ni Senator.
178
ngayon. Kasi Tuesday pa yan. How about you, Secretary Salvador?
So, sir, nagbibilang na tayo? Hindi. Sila nagbibilang, hindi tayo.
Final words as a Secretary.
Well, as the President,
sa mga posibleng nangangamba na mawala ang VFA.
This is a new foreign policy. And the foreign policy is friends to all, enemies to none. And he says that the foreign policy will be based solely on our national interests and general welfare of the people. Yun.
Okay. Presidential Spokesperson Salvador Panelo. Sir, maraming salamat po sa inyo. Good to see you. And of course, to the former Senators Orly Mercado and Senator Pong Biazon. Maraming salamat din po sa inyong dalawa. Thank you for joining us here on The Source. I'm Pinky Webb. You're watching CNN Philippines.